Hello and welcome to the Controversies in Church History podcast. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for this podcast. This is a reminder that you can find controversies in church history on various social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and also on Patreon. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, this is a free podcast for most people. I try to make it available through as many platforms and different types of social media as I can, but I do actually try to advertise every once in a while. I do have a few expenses for doing this, and it is a lot of work. So this is supposed to be a service. You're not supposed to you don't have to do this, but if you'd like to become a patron of our podcast, go to patreon.com and you'll find our Patreon page on Patreon, where you can become a donor, a monthly donor. I think it's $5, $7, and $10 to help out defray some of the cost of this stuff. Going forward, I'm going to start doing more things, interviews of those sorts of nature for patrons on Patreon, to focus more on that. So if you want to keep supporting the podcast, keep it going. All the episodes, in terms of the archive of what I've done, will be available free. Eventually they'll be made after a month or so, all the new ones, but if you become a patron, you get new episodes a month in advance. You get some other things, bonus features that I won't make available. All the regular episodes will be available to all people. So just to help out and say thank you to some of my donors. So if you'd like to do that, please go to patreon.com and think about signing up. Thank you and God bless. Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. My name is Derek Taylor. I'm your host for this podcast, which takes you through the most interesting, important, and controversial episodes in the history of the Catholic Church. Welcome once again to our podcast. Remember, you can find Controversies in Church History on the web at churchcontroversies.com, my website, which has links to all my episodes, as well as to articles I've written in other various venues like Crisis Magazine and others. Also on Facebook, Facebook page, on YouTube, where I post most of the content, and on Twitter, where I post various things from time to time. You can also, if you'd like to become, if you want to help me out with the podcast, you can become a patron, with our Patreon account, which you can find Controversies in Church History there as well. All that's available if you search for us on the web. Thank you for listening once again. Thank you to all my listeners, all my patrons. This episode's another sort of Catholic Lives episode, a sort of mini biography of non-sainted figures from Catholic history. And this time we have an interesting one. Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem. And this actual episode was actually suggested to me by my nephew, Clay. So this is for you, Clay. And so we're going to talk about the brief reign of one of the Crusader kings of the Crusader states, who actually had leprosy. And so, and get the background for this right, just people who, if you haven't, don't know much about the Crusades, the first Crusade was called 1096 to free the holy sites and the Holy Land from Muslim control. This succeeded in 1099, and what happened is that the Crusaders set up 4 states from north to south. In the north, the county of Edessa, going south from there, the Principality of Antioch, centered on the city of Antioch. Going south from there, the county of Tripoli, down to the most southern kingdom state is the Kingdom of Jerusalem, centered on Jerusalem. Mostly there's coastal territories in what would be today modern Israel, Syria, and Lebanon, except for Edessa, which is kind of in northern Mesopotamia, up that way. But they formed these states in order to protect Christian access, Christian control to these holy sites, Christian holy sites, which have been under Muslim rule for many centuries at that point, and then, pilgrims going to them. Excuse me. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem was given to Baldwin I, who was the brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, who was one of the main leaders of the First Crusade. After Godfrey's death, French Crusaders welcomed him into Jerusalem, and he was crowned king in 1100. And so this is a feudal kingdom we're talking about here. It's the Middle Ages, and most of not all of them, but most of the Crusaders who made it to the not just the First Crusade, but pretty much throughout the rest of the
the Middle Ages, at least to the Near East, were in some senses French. Again, I say in some senses there's no modern France in the ancient in medieval Europe, but Baldwin came from the city of Bologna on the north coast of France. Many of those original Crusaders who made it to the Holy Land were, people who spoke Old French, and Old French actually became the dominant language of the Crusader states. So great was their domination of the Crusader states. Muslims actually refer to the Crusaders in general as Franks or Frange. So if you see translations of, Arab accounts of the Crusaders, they just call them all Franks. So you have this feudal kingdom, which is passed down for the eldest surviving son. That's primogeniture. Survives for about 200 years, and this is the kingdom that Baldwin IV will rule. Mostly by conquering coastal cities in the region around Jerusalem and collecting customs duties on trade. Later on in its history, toward its end, it's established in 1100, is finally swallowed up in 1291. In the 13th century, the kingdom will fall under the control of great noble families that are resident in the Holy Land. But in the 12th century, during Baldwin's lifetime, it's ruled by the king in a pretty straightforward way. Although there's other factors involved. We'll get to this. One thing to note about all this, and this is set in the context of Baldwin IV's life, because the most obvious thing about him is he had leprosy and he was a king, and that's an interesting thing, obviously. But he was in a very precarious situation. Because the only reason the Crusades succeeded in a lot of ways is because the Muslim world was very divided at the time they landed there. Big division, which will last until the reign of Baldwin IV, is that you have several Muslim leaders in what's modern-day Syria fighting out for control. You also have a dynasty in Egypt called the Fatimid dynasty, which is a Shiite dynasty. Shia and Sunni are the two branches of Islam. They don't get along, so they're divided. And any sort of reunion of a major power in the Holy Land or in that area would be a serious threat to these Crusader states, which is what happens, of course, and in the course of time. But when it was founded in 1100, Baldwin rules for 18 years. He's succeeded by Baldwin II from 1118 to 1131. It's then during this period that the kingdom expands, begins to expand. There were never more than like 600,000 people in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Most of them were not Westerners. There were about 140,000 Franks, or people from the Western territories, Western Europe. And so they needed manpower to fight battles. And so this is where you get the creation of the crusading orders. The Knights Templar and the Knights of Malta were founded for other purposes. The Knights Templar were founded to protect pilgrims on the way to the Holy Land. Knights of Malta were Knights of St. John of Malta are hospitalers. They set up hospitals, but they were turned into military orders to provide manpower for fighting. And this happens in the reign of Baldwin, more or less. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is recognized, by the way, in his reign as the suzerain. He's sovereign over the other Crusader states during his reign. Again, this is a feudal setup we're talking about here. This doesn't last. It's not like it's an official thing. He doesn't become king of all these other places, but they have feudal relationships to each other. He succeeded in 1132 by Folk of Jerusalem, he will bring with him more people. He's from Anjou in southern France, so he brings more new knights into the territories, new blood from France. There'll be some friction with the Christian population that had grown up there since the founding of the kingdom. Sometimes this is overdone, but it's there. He's also the king is Folk, who constructs the great fortress called the Croix de Chevalier south of Jerusalem. It still exists. It was actually taken over by the Muslims, but it's there. He dies in 1143. He's succeeded by Baldwin III, who is kind of the ideal king. At least the medieval chroniclers like William of Tyre. We'll get to him in a moment. He was one of the major sources for Baldwin IV's life. He comes to the throne right around the time of the Second Crusade, because in 1144, the Muslim leader Nur ad-Din captures the city of Damascus, and the county of Edessa is taken over as well, so that gets done away with, and you only have the three states left. And he was not successful. It was a failure of the Second Crusade, but he did expand the kingdom south. This is kind of theme here. The kingdom's trying to expand south because from the north you have Muslim incursions becoming more and more prominent. And in fact, Baldwin III captures the last port in Muslim hands, Ascalon, 1153. So the coast is under their control for the next several decades. And so the orientation of the kingdom's policy kind of moves south. One other thing that he does, which is kind of important, it's kind of in the background of all this, is that not just these feudal ties among his own noblemen are in the background of Baldwin IV's life, but also other powers. I mentioned the Muslim powers, one other big power in the region, and that's the Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantinople. And the Byzantines had actually called for Western aid. That had been the impetus initially for the First Crusade. They'd had some falling outs during the First Crusade. Some of their ties had been their relations had been kind of tense. They get better over time. And in fact, it's Baldwin III who makes rapprochement with the Byzantines, and he marries a Byzantine princess, Theodora, the niece of the Emperor Emmanuel Komnenos I, who was generally favorable toward the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And nothing comes of this, but however, in terms of help against the Muslims, but Manuel actually does marry one of the Crusader princesses, Maria of Antioch, 1161. And they do this for protection. The idea is you become a vassal, not a vassal exactly, but you're under the sovereignty of the Byzantine emperor because they want his protection. Baldwin III dies in 1163, and he's succeeded by his brother Amalric, who is the father of Baldwin, which we'll get to in a second. Excuse me. He tries to invade. Again, they're having less, success in the north. They invade Egypt a couple of times during his reign. Has some success, but nothing comes of this. Tries to get. He also marries into the Byzantine Empire. Tries to get them to have a joint invasion of Egypt. However, you also have something else happening in the reign of Amalric, which is the rise of Saladin. Saladin is the vizier of Egypt. Egypt at this point still a Shiite. At that point was still a Shiite polity. What happens is there's a joint expedition against Egypt with the Byzantines. It fails that year, 1169. The next year, Saladin invades Jerusalem, takes a city on the Red Sea. And a year later, in 1171, he's proclaimed Sultan. All of a sudden, the Fatimid Caliphate is turned into a Sunni state again. What that means is there's the real prospect now of uniting the Muslims in the north with Muslims in the south, and this is real dangerous for the kingdom. And Amalric actually dies after trying to siege one of the cities in the north in 1174. And is succeeded by his son. And his father was Amalric, as I said, who was also the Count of Jaffa. County, we'll get these terms, by the way. Principality means prince, county means count. That's where you get the titles from. He was the son of Amalric and Agnes of Courtenay, a French noblewoman. In 1161, he was born, was Baldwin IV. Baldwin III acted as his godfather. And what happened was when Amalric became king, he was forced by the High Court of Jerusalem. And the High Court, this is hard to understand, is a sort of feudal council of the kingdom, which could make decisions. And they needed this partly because you had kings, they might die, you might not have an immediate heir available, you might have a minority, a kid, so you couldn't have him rule. This is one of their functions. They had a lot of functions, actually. It's kind of hard to explain. I don't want to go into it here, but the High Court basically forced Amalric, when he became king, to annul his marriage to Agnes of Courtenay, who is the mother of Baldwin IV. I know this is confusing, but it's important to note for his reign. For reasons, by the way, we're still not sure why they did it, but Amalric did it, and Agnes remarried Hugh of Ibelin, while Amalric married Maria Comnena, the great niece of Manuel I. And so, as a result of this, Baldwin and his sister Sybil were both recognized as legitimate, but he was separated from his birth mother, who would come back into his life a little later on. And early on in his life, Baldwin IV was tutored by William of Tyre. William of Tyre was the Archbishop of Tyre in the Middle East, born in the Holy Land, wrote a chronicle of the reigns of the Kingdom of Jerusalem up to 1184. And Amalric made William of Tyre his tutor. And so his history is a primary source for Baldwin's life. It's one of the two major sources for this period in his life, both of which come from different perspectives. As you'll see, William of Tyre was a supporter of the Count of Tripoli, who wants to succeed Baldwin IV. We'll get to that in a second. But it was William who first recognized Baldwin's illness when he was a kid. He recognized him, noticed him playing with other boys his age, and not crying out when he was hit with a sword, when he was poked with something. And he realized he was losing feeling in his limbs. And we should need to stop here and talk about this for a second. Leprosy and its place in medieval society. Amalric had Arab doctors treat Baldwin, one of whom was an Arab Christian, who also, by the way, this brother of the guy who taught him, actually taught Baldwin IV how to ride a horse with one hand, because by the time he got to that age, he lost all sensation in the other hand. So, and in fact, Baldwin, by all accounts, became an excellent horseman, and he only stopped when he became too ill to ride. But in general, medieval societies in Europe tend to be very ambivalent about those who contracted this disease. The reason why is that it was incurable. It seemed such an affliction. A lot of people often saw it as a punishment from God. Again, this is a this is a medieval society. They tend to see things directly related to God. Everything is directly related in that sense. So they weren't always very kind to people like this. Things were a little different in the Holy Land. There, lepers were also segregated because people believed the disease was contagious, but there were also hospitals built for them, specifically outside of Jerusalem. And in fact, there was even an order of hospitalers called the Order of St. Lazarus, specifically for those with leprosy. Sometime around 1140 was founded, whose members had leprosy, whose primary function was to run some of those hospitals. We do know, though, however, that a couple of these and a couple of battles in the 13th century, long after Baldwin's life, that the Order of St. Lazarus, they actually fought in battles too. So maybe a little bit different view of these things in the Middle East, given the very precarious situation they're in. They need fighters, they need warriors there. And again, not everybody in Western Europe was so dismissive of this, but there was this attitude there. And yet he was, as you'll see, Baldwin, despite all this, was quite well liked by all of his people, was well thought of in spite of his illness. And so what happens is he comes into his minority in 1174 because he can't rule. He's not old enough yet. He's only 13. And so the High Court convenes. They name Baldwin IV the king in 1174. We do know, by the way, that this wasn't automatic. They could have chosen someone else, despite the fact it's a primogeniture thing. We know from a letter of Saladin, actually, because he had a good network of spies in the kingdom, that it took some debate to convince people to accept him, because presumably because of his illness, probably because it wasn't totally clear at that point it was leprosy. That and there's a lack of a suitable alternative probably decided the matter. And so he was crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem on July 15th, 1174, which that date's important. That was the anniversary of the capture of Jerusalem by the First Crusaders. And so he's governed for the first couple of years by a couple of different regents who run the kingdom. We know, by the way, his personality, according to William of Tyre, that Baldwin was bright. He did well with his studies, had a good memory, loved hearing stories. He liked history, so you can't say much better about him than that, right? And that before he became disfigured by his illness, he was handsome like his father and spoke with a stammer, as he did like his father. I should mention here as well is that even though he was seen kind of as a saintly figure to a certain degree by some people, there's no real evidence he was particularly devout. He did provide some funding for a foundation for an abbey there, but he wasn't necessarily the most pious king. He was more of a knight, according to Bernard Hamilton, one of his biographers, than he was the pious king, but did have that personality trait. And what happens is, early in his minority, his regents enact a planned assault on Egypt. And what happens is they had made an alliance with the kingdom of Sicily in southern Italy to come down. This is the Norman kingdom of Sicily, to attack Egypt, which they did. And for reasons that are still not clear, the kingdom of Jerusalem failed to support them, and the mission failed. Again, this is a missed opportunity for reasons that don't seem to be. This goes back to the infighting among advisors of the kingdom at that point. And in fact, the first regent's actually assassinated in 1174 because he was so unpopular, a guy named Miles de Plants. And he was replaced by the Count of Tripoli, Raymond of Tripoli, in 1174. And one of the things that's going on is by 1176, it's pretty clear Baldwin IV is suffering from leprosy. Just at the time that Saladin is beginning to defeat his enemies in Syria in the north and unite it with Egypt against the Franks. Though he was never segregated from others during his life, Baldwin IV was not. The High Court that year married off his sister Sybil to William of Montferrat to have someone to run the kingdom if he fell ill. And this is something that happened on and off throughout his life. Also, of course, Baldwin, having the disease, could not bear children, so that's another reason for this. And again, this was kind of a mistake. This was meant to ally, because William of Montferrat was, again, a Western knight who was a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. But this antagonized the Byzantines and basically did nothing against Saladin while he was still building up his power. So Raymond's idea wasn't, there's some thought behind it, but again, you have these machinations going on during his regency. However, by 1176, 2 years after his coronation, he turns 15, he comes of age, and he takes power. He changes policies almost immediately, leads a raid into Aleppo, this is in the north, city in the north, that July against Saladin's troops. Saladin, knowing at that point that all the agreements, he had made agreements, peace agreements with Raymond of Tripoli, knew these didn't hold now that Baldwin was king, temporarily made peace with his enemies in Damascus and withdrew. Baldwin and his fourth and his advisors were planning another attack on Egypt. They sought out and renewed the alliance with Manuel I of Byzantium. And this is 1177 by this point, I should say. And this when this attack takes place. This is a big attack. We'll get this one in a second. But that year, William of Montferrat, his sister's husband, dies. This is important to note for reasons we'll get into in a second. But he also falls ill, and so he has to appoint a regent for the first time. He's ill on and off throughout his reign. But in particular, in 1377, help comes from the Western Europe, a crusade. Philip of Flanders, the Count of Flanders, arrives in 1377. And Baldwin IV actually offers him the regency. He can take over the kingdom while he's sick, but he refuses. He's got problems back in Flanders. He's worried what happens if he'll stay away too long from his lands there. And so he refuses this. And in fact, as well, you also have concern on the part of Manuel I, the Byzantine emperor, about Frankish commitment to the project. And so he declines to take part in the attack on Egypt, as does Philip, who turns back instead of going south to help them with the attack, goes north and fights with the Count of Tripoli and the Prince of Antioch in Syria instead of going south into Egypt. And Philip did this, by the way, because one of the conditions of Manuel helping the Crusaders is that they had to accept his sovereignty, which Philip of Flanders didn't want to do. And this is a huge missed opportunity because they combined their forces. They could have easily dealt a big blow to Saladin, which they did not do, and stopped his rise. Nevertheless, while Philip and the Count of Tripoli and the Prince of Antioch were out fighting in the north, Saladin invades, attacks the kingdom of Jerusalem from the south. And this is 1177. This is the scene of his finest hour, Baldwin IV, because he leads in person, riding with one hand, along with Raynon of Châtillon, who was his regent. They surprised, I think they had like 367 knights and a few thousand troops. They surprised a much larger army under Saladin at Montgizar and routed it, literally making Saladin flee for his life. He almost died. And it was a great victory, huge victory, much rejoicing in the kingdom, very costly. Some 1,100 Christians died in the fighting, which is a very high number for a kingdom with so few soldiers to begin with. And what happens is he gets defeated a couple of years later by Saladin, who invades again, even though Saladin withdraws. And there's just not a lot of help forthcoming from the West for a variety of reasons. You have these knights like Philip of Flanders, who there's some support for the crusading states, but they're more concerned with fighting each other in Europe. You also have lack of help from the Fourth Lateran Council, which is meeting in 1179, doesn't do much to help them. You also, so you have the betrothal of his sister Sybil again to someone from the West, Hugh III of Burgundy. William of Tyre is sent on an embassy to the Byzantine Empire to try to restore things there. And in the middle of all this, Count Raymond of Tripoli and Prince Bohemond of Antioch try to stage a coup in 1180. They want to depose Baldwin IV and marry his sister off to a candidate more suitable to them, one they can control, because Raymond wants to succeed him as king, because they know he's going to die at some point. By 1180, it's pretty clear he's not going to live too much longer. And what happens is, to head this off, Baldwin IV and his advisors marry his sister Sybil off to someone else, Guy de Lusignan. And this is huge to understand here, because this sets the backdrop for the end of his reign and for the eventual conquest of Jerusalem by Saladin. This leads to a serious division between those allied with Guy, which is mostly the maternal members of his family, his mother Agnes, his sister Sybil, Prince Renan, his uncle, on that side, and those were people who are supporters of Raymond of Tripoli, Bohemond, Baldwin, and male members of his family, Baldwin and Balian of Ibelin, and his Byzantine wife, Maria Komnena. This is stuff that doesn't really come out. If you're thinking of the film Kingdom of Heaven, that's made into a schlock story, but it's basically a feudal dispute, which really undermines the stability of the kingdom when they need to be united against Saladin at that point. And the only thing that keeps them together is, while he lives, is Baldwin. It's his stature, his magnanimity. People will listen to him. And things take a turn in 1180 that same year for another reason. Manuel I of Byzantium dies. You also have the takeover of Byzantium a couple of years later by Andronicus Comnenus, who seizes power in Constantinople. And that's important because the regime that had been placed before this, Manuel and his initial successor, had been friendly to the Crusaders. Andronicus came to power, seized power, because there was a serious revulsion against Westerners in Constantinople. Italian merchants, for example, were slaughtered in a big riot in 1182. And so this means there's no more help coming from Byzantium. There's also not a lot of help coming from Europe. Pope Alexander III writes a bull talking about having aid to the Western kingdoms in 1181. But he criticizes Baldwin IV for being a leper, saying he's cursed by God and all this stuff. So some harsh language here from the West, and things aren't going well. And so at the same time, 1182, Saladin invades again. And again, the Leper King, this point, he has to go in a litter. He can't actually fight anymore, but he's carried on a litter. His forces defeat Saladin at the Battle of Le Faubourg in 1182. They try to lay siege to Beirut in that same year. They're forced to withdraw. He does manage, before his death, his forces to restore the eastern borders of the kingdom. And there's managed to have some raids on Saladin's troops in the area of the Red Sea, which actually backfire on them for a variety of reasons. But by 1183, it's pretty clear that he's going to die. He's lost his sight by 1183. That same year, he names Guy de Lusignan regent of the kingdom after he falls ill. However, and this actually gets into, I think this gets into the film anyway. The film sucks, so it doesn't matter, but I'm thinking this stuff is probably your frame of reference. If you're listening to this, Guy's actions, when Saladin invades again that year, Saladin sends a massive army. They actually pass attacks, and they assemble probably the biggest army they've ever had. I think like over 10,000 troops, which is huge for that kingdom. They don't have many people to go fight Saladin. And Guy basically never really engages with Saladin. He manages to get him to withdraw, but Saladin causes a lot of damage in the southern area of the kingdom. And this causes pretty much all the nobles in his kingdom to lose confidence in Guy. And so Baldwin has to get rid of him, basically. He crowns his nephew, Baldwin, as co-king that year, as Baldwin V. And he tried to order Guy to have his marriage annulled in order to keep him from any claim to the throne. But Guy defies him. He literally just holds up in his castle, says no, and his sister actually goes along with this. Sybil loves him, so this happens to the end of his reign. Never does force him to come to heel. Nonetheless, in 1184, just before he dies, he appoints Raymond of Tripoli as his regent, although not without serious restrictions. And then in 1185, after meeting with all the great nobles of the kingdom one last time, receiving their homage, Even Bohemond comes from Antioch. They kind of know this is the last time I'll see him. 1185, on May 16th that year, he passes away, not quite 24 years old, still 23. If you don't know the rest of the story, this is basically at this point, you have this divided kingdom. Saladin will invade in 1187. Eventually will retake Jerusalem. Doesn't destroy the kingdom itself. The Third Crusade, this is Richard I and all this stuff. They come and basically fight him to a standstill. And the kingdom of Jerusalem goes on, just they lose the city of Jerusalem, even though they'll still have access to pilgrimage sites as a result of the Third Crusade. But it's the end of that era, the end of when they controlled this stuff. And you see this, and this is one of the reasons why you get this this image sometimes of Baldwin in medieval chronicles as this, saintly figure. He suffered this horrible disease, yet he fought bravely. He ruled well. He would have been a good ruler if he had lived long enough. And if he had lived, who knows? They had chances to prevent Saladin from uniting the Muslim forces against him. But an interesting and in some ways Catholic life, in that he was a chivalric knight. If he wasn't necessarily the most personally devout, did his best to protect the kingdom that was put into his hands. And a fascinating, I think, portrait of a medieval king, something to think about and ponder and consider. And so that is it for this episode of Controversial Church History. Hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, go leave comments, on the Facebook page or somewhere else. Leave some feedback for me. I appreciate to hear from you guys. I want to do the best I can to serve y'all in this endeavor. Remember, you can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, at churchcontroversies.com, my website, on Patreon if you want to become a patron, and on YouTube as well. Don't know when the next episode's coming out. I'll be traveling in the next week or so, but hopefully not too long before I get to the next thing. And please keep me in your prayers. I appreciate it. Everyone, the support, listening, and let me know this stuff works for you. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for listening. God bless all my patrons. God bless you and have a great week. You'll hear from me soon. Bye-bye.